What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with TechDaily, and in this video, we're going to be doing a full comparison between this year's new 2021 Moto G Power and last year's Moto G Power. Now, usually we'd be talking about all the great new upgrades and add-ons a new version of a phone would have, but unfortunately, with the new Moto G Power this year, that's just not the case. In fact, last year's version of this phone is objectively the better device in a lot of ways, and I'm going to explain all the reasons why in this video. There's a lot to go over, so I won't waste any more time. Let's first talk about the pricing and configuration options because that's already something worth considering. The new 2021 Moto G Power retails right now for $199 unlocked, which technically is cheaper than last year, but that's for the configuration with just 3 GB of RAM and 32 GB of internal storage, a new option this year. The $249 configuration is the one with 4 gigs of RAM and 64 GB of storage, and that is the same price and same specs as last year. So while some people might suggest this year's phone is cheaper, it's not really. The cheaper price point just gets you lower specs. And actually, since last year's Moto G Power has been out for a while now, obviously, you can snag that phone at a discount anyway from places like Amazon. So all in all, last year's phone is likely going to be the better deal if we're doing a straight price and configuration comparison. And if you guys are interested in doing some comparison shopping of your own, I'll leave some links down below in the video description to all the deals and discounts. Now, physically, these two phones do look pretty different, and actually at a glance, I do like the changes Motorola brought to the new Moto G Power. It's now a bit larger of a device, 6.6 inches versus 6.4 last year, and getting a little more screen real estate for consuming content is kind of nice, especially since it's not so big that it's tough to hold. Mainly just a little taller, but still I think a pretty good size. Design-wise, at least up front, most everything stayed the same. You've got identical corner hole punch camera cutouts up front, slim bezels along the sides, and a similar thicker bottom chin. Nothing really more to say here. I think this setup is perfectly fine. Around back is where most of the noticeable physical changes can be found. Both phones are still made of plastic, but this year's new Moto G Power received this sort of imitation metal looking housing versus the glossy finish last year. And again, I kind of like this change. It at least makes the new phone look more premium, even though it's not. And not having to worry about those gross fingerprints is kind of nice too. They both also have metal frames and a curvy tapered edge, but overall the changes are just visual. The new phone, like last year, is still a budget-friendly plastic device in all the same ways. Taking a look around, we've got the same SIM and SD card tray on the left. The headphone jack has moved up top on the new Moto G Power versus the bottom placement last year. Both phones have a USB-C charging port and bottom speaker. On the right, there's the volume buttons and power button, which also doubles as the fingerprint sensor on the new phone. Last year's device had the sensor around back. There's a new camera setup, which I'll go over, of course, but let's jump back to the speaker for a second. This is the first change on a long list of negative changes, downgrades, really, with the new phone. We lose the dual stereo speaker setup completely. Last year's phone had a secondary speaker in the earpiece. This year, on the new Moto G Power, Motorola just took that extra speaker away. And that's really disappointing. I'm a big proponent of stereo speakers. I think it was a nice addition on an affordable phone like this. And just straight up removing it is a really bad move. But that's not the worst change. The most disappointing thing about the new Moto G Power is the display. Last year, we got a full HD 2300 by 1080 screen. It was an IPS LCD panel that packed in 399 pixels per inch. This year, the new Moto G Power has just a 1600 by 720 resolution display at 266 pixels per inch. And yes, it's still an IPS LCD panel. It is objectively a worse display, not just because of the lower resolution, but because it's a lower resolution on a larger overall screen. And this to me just makes no sense. Now, I don't know if everyone cares about this or can even tell a difference. From a normal viewing distance, there's nothing drastically different. The overall color and max brightness and viewing experience seem to all look identical at least. But side by side, when viewing text, for example, a little closer up, I think most anyone can see pretty easily that last year's Moto G Power is obviously a sharper looking display. And if you care even a little bit about specs or value for your money, and you see 720p display versus 1080p display, you can probably recognize that lower resolution is worse by comparison. My biggest complaint here isn't the 720p display itself on the new Moto G Power. It's obviously not great, but the real issue is simply the fact that Motorola straight up downgraded one of the most important aspects of a smartphone, seemingly for no reason. And it's not only disappointing, it's a little insulting to Motorola customers, I think. Overall, this is probably my biggest complaint and one of the main reasons why I can't recommend this new phone over last year's. But if you can believe it, there's actually even more here that they took away. Around back, the camera setup on the new Moto G Power appears to be an upgrade versus last year, at least at first glance. You get a 48 megapixel main lens now versus the 16 megapixel shooter on the old phone. There's a macro lens on both devices. And the Moto G Power this year added a depth sensor for potentially better portrait shots. But once again, Motorola took away a solid feature. There's now no more ultra-wide lens, something I personally use quite often, certainly more than the macro lens, and likely even more than the depth sensor too. And while the camera app itself has been redesigned for the better, it's much easier to switch between shooting modes and find certain features, this new phone drops 4K video recording entirely, which I don't really understand. So all in all, while I do think the standard shots with the new Moto G Power are going to be better than last year's phone, not everything in the camera department is an improvement. And capability-wise, I think there is a little less to offer. Also, the selfie camera seems to be different as well, and again, not in a good way. Last year, we got a 16 megapixel selfie lens. This year, it's an 8 megapixel shooter. Now, in this case, the specs don't tell the whole story. I think the new Moto G Power does take better selfie shots at least. There seems to be more detail, the color is better, so thankfully, that seems to be okay. But what could have been an easy, complete upgrade with the camera setup once again winds up being, I guess, a weird mishmash of pros and cons. But really, it's just Motorola taking away good stuff from last year's phone, which is super frustrating. Now, it's not all bad news. There are a couple other solid positive changes. For example, the fingerprint sensor on the power button now I consider to be pretty good. The placement is super comfortable, it's plenty quick, and I'm glad Motorola decided to switch things up here. In fact, it seems to be a little faster to get to the home screen too. In addition to that, Motorola brought back Face Unlock, which is something they've been taking away from previous phones. And this, to me, works great too. So the unlocking methods here are all pretty solid. And the whole point of the Moto G Power, namely its big, beefy battery, is still here too. We get the same 5,000 milliamp capacity inside. Definitely one of the things that makes this phone such a good value on its own. And actually, the 15 watt charging speed support is technically a little quicker than the 10 watt standard on last year's phone, so I guess that's a little bit of an upgrade if you want to call it that. Fortunately, the Moto G Power overall is still a powerhouse of a phone when it comes to battery life. But the last piece of the puzzle here, the internal specs, are once again kind of disappointing. Last year's phone had a Qualcomm Snapdragon 665 chipset inside. This year we get the Snapdragon 662, which even though it's a lower number, it's fortunately not a complete downgrade, more of a sidestep. It's a newer processor just of the same caliber. And like I explained already, you get the same 4 gigs of RAM and 64 gigabytes of internal storage in both phones as well. So all in all, we're dealing with basically the same specs, and the Geekbench scores pretty much confirm that. Even though the new phone has a newer processor inside, it's just not that much more powerful. And a side-by-side speed test shows that as well. In fact, the phones seem to go back and forth even as far as which launches and loads things first. Now, I realize that these aren't flagship devices. They don't exactly compete to be the newest, fastest smartphones with all the latest stuff. But year over year, I don't think it's unfair to think that the newer phone should be better than the older regular phone. And to me, that's just not really the case here with the internal specs. In fact, I'm not really sure that's the case with anything on the new Moto G Power. I personally don't feel like this device has any noticeable, significant, or otherwise important upgrades or changes over last year. And to be honest, I'm not really sure I've said that about any new device. In fact, it seems to me that there are more things about the new Moto G Power that are worse than last year compared to better, and that's just super disappointing. Last year's Moto G Power was a really popular device, mainly because it was genuinely good. It offered a lot for the money. This year, the new Moto G Power is an okay phone, I guess, if it existed without anything to compare it to, but we have to compare it to last year. And when we do, we can see that it is absolutely a downgrade. So with all that being said, if you do have last year's phone, I really don't think there's a single reason to upgrade. And if you're looking at the Moto G Power for the first time, I'd probably consider just getting last year's phone. You're not missing out on anything at all. In fact, it seems to be the better device in a lot of ways. And you can probably even get it at a discount now, since it is about a year old. All in all, what Motorola gave us here is a confusing and disappointing new device that's simply worse than the previous version. And it's a shame they decided to take that route. So there you go. Those are all of my thoughts on the new Moto G Power versus last year's. What do you guys think? Was I maybe too difficult, or did I miss something here? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to know your thoughts, of course. But hopefully you guys did enjoy this video. Be sure to follow TechDaily on Twitter and subscribe to the TechDaily YouTube channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys later.